Good morning, everyone. Today I wanted to talk about one of the common companion topics of time, and that is space. Now, I did a series of 3 Dharma Talks last week related to the time and how that is philosophized and explained both scientifically and also within the Buddhist tradition. And I'd like to talk today about space. Now, space is slightly less explained and gone into in Buddhism, but I think it is also a very interesting topic, and ultimately is something that explains the practice and explains Buddhism to at least touch on that topic. Now, in a way, we've all come very far to be here at this particular time and in this particular space. Depending on your own beliefs and philosophy, we may have traveled some hundreds or thousands, many millennia maybe even, to be in this particular time, in this particular space. And we're incredibly lucky, incredibly blessed, and have generated over this time lots of great karma in order to finally be here and to hear the Buddhist teaching. Now, the space of the Buddha, of course, historically was the area above and below the Ganges River, 500 years approximately, almost 600 years now, back in time. And in that space, there were many traditions within specifically Brahmanism or what would become Hinduism. There are many spiritual teachers doing meditation. Many of them engaged in lots of ceremonial practices, which in theory would give spiritual insight, and also operated within their own philosophies of, again, space, the universe, the solar system, and all of that. Now, we can speculate. I don't know if there's a whole lot of information about whether or not the Buddha actually believed in a solar system or galaxies or all of that. But as we examine what he called the little handful of leaves in that sermon, he said that there's much more that he knew of beyond this little bit, this handful of leaves that he explained to the disciples. And we can speculate, and certainly some Buddhist traditions and teachers go into how he did understand or know about the universe and the infinite nature of the space and time. But I'm not going to go into that into great detail. But the important thing, I think, is that within the space, the historic area of maybe 300 square miles, approximately 500 square kilometers, that the Buddha traveled in between what is now Lumbini in Nepal, and then the south of the Ganges, to be in areas of Sarnath and Gaya, which would become Bodh Gaya, in all these areas around in that area, which was very important because it had civilizations, and it also had, of course, people who had meditative practices and traditions that they had already kind of been engaged in as a culture. And so then the Buddha kind of put his kind of fit within the jigsaw puzzle of that space. As Bhikkhu Bodhi, one of the great Theravada masters, and particularly a scholar of translation of the Nikayas, the Theravada tradition, as he put it, basically the Buddha's body was his space, and as the Buddha said, that the body and the mind, in fact, are your own personal universe. So, so basically the Buddha's space, or his universe, was in fact his body. And I can quote from Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation of the Samyutta Nikaya, a great series put out by, I believe it's the, I'm trying to remember the name of the publication house in Massachusetts near Boston, but I don't recall the name of it right now. But the name, it's a three-part series, and it is the Connected Discourses of the Buddha, a translation of the Samyutta Nikaya by Bhikkhu Bodhi. And this particular piece I'm going to quote from is on page 1516, and how Bhikkhu Bodhi explains kind of space of the universe within the Buddhist tradition as he interprets it. And he says that the Buddha calls space, or in particular the body, as, quote, the Tathagata's dwelling. And so the body is where the Tathagata, at the time that he was the historical Buddha, was his universe. And in particular, Bhikkhu Bodhi explains mindfulness of breathing, which is anapanasati, as essentially the universe, or the world, or the dwelling of the Buddha, and in turn the dwelling of Buddhist practitioners. So he says mindfulness of breathing is anapanasati, is generally taught as the most important subject in the Nikayas. It is the way to attain the four jhanas and the three true knowledges. And again, Bhikkhu Bodhi quotes and says that he, referring to the Buddha, calls it the Tathagata's dwelling. So why is this so important that the Buddha goes on to say that in fact the breath and the body are the dwelling? Because in another quote, the Buddha said that the mind is the world. And so in that way, the Buddha taught that you don't really need to worry about the universe. You don't really have to worry about if the earth is flat or if the earth is round, if the sun goes around the earth, or for vice versa. Because essentially, as Bhikkhu Bodhi reminds us, that mindfulness of breathing is essentially the universe in the Buddhist perspective. And really, through that, you get an idea of space. Now, as I borrowed from the three great traditions for my talks on time, I want to also, of course, borrow from another tradition, in this case, Vajrayana, or Tibetan Buddhism, to explain space in Buddhism. And there's a very interesting and good book published in 1984 by Chögyam Trungpa, Chögyam Trungpa, and he wrote a book, Shambhala, The Sacred Path of the Warrior. And on page 154, he gives a very interesting talk about explaining space in Buddhism, and basically explains how tea, and how sugar dissolved in a cup of tea is a way of explaining how the Buddha understood space, and that essentially his body and his mind would become dissolved as sugar becomes dissolved in a cup of tea. So on page 154, quote, "The fruition of the warrior's path is the experience of primordial goodness, or the complete, unconditional nature of basic goodness." And then another quote from that page, "Even a simple act of drinking a cup of tea contains many reference points." And so on that page he goes into how you can take a teaspoon of sugar and put that in a cup of tea and dissolve it. And in that simple everyday act, you can come to understand something as profound, as incredible as how the Buddha's mind, and in turn the mind of every enlightened being, becomes dissolved in a universe. So in that way, using this very simple simile, we can understand the concept of space within the Buddhist teaching. Now both the Theravada tradition that Bhikkhu Bodhi comes from and the Tibetan tradition that Trungpa comes from have lots of these kind of folktale kind of sayings, very simplistic kind of sayings that explain in everyday terms these incredible and profound teachings. And so I think essentially, as Bhikkhu Bodhi says, that the most important thing really is to realize that within our own minds we have a universe. And I think that really is what the practice really is about. It really brings us back, as Christmas Humphreys said in his book, Coming Full Circle, that in fact, the breath and breath meditation is really emphasized in Tibetan tradition and also the Theravada tradition, and so that essentially by remembering this we really come full circle. Thank you. May you all become enlightened.